everyone. It's David Thompson again with Behind the Lines for the Civil War Monitor. I'm joined today by Kevin Levin, who is the writer of the blog Civil War Memory, historian, and author of Remembering the Battle of the Crater, War as Murder, which is now out with the University Press of Kentucky. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Nice to be here.
If you don't mind, could you just share with our viewers a little bit, just general gist of what this book really is all about?
So I think the book attempts to explore broadly Civil War memory through one particular battle, through the Battle of the Crater, which took place on July 30th of 1864. And it focuses specifically on the issue of race. As most of your viewers probably know, this is that moment in the Petersburg campaign where the Union Army attempts to use, or does use, an entire division of black soldiers, in an attack that starts off with that huge explosion under a Confederate salient. And so the book sort of looks at, in large part, sort of how Confederates sort of responded to the presence of these men, these black soldiers, and then after the war, of course, how these stories evolve, why by the turn of the century they're being pushed aside, and then in the last few decades, some of the challenges involved in bringing these stories back. And I think it has elements of, the David Blight thesis. I think readers will find a good deal of that. But it also, I think, in certain ways deviates from it. So it definitely fits into that whole recent output of Civil War memory books.
And I wonder if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit more about how it actually deviates from Blight, because I mean you make that very clear in your introduction, and I know our readers, I'm sure, and our viewers are very familiar with Blight's Race and Reunion, really a game changer when it comes obviously to memory studies and the war, but you are charting a little bit of a different path, so I wonder if you might be able to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think a slightly different path, though like I said, I think there are elements of, especially the reconciliation that Blight focuses on in Race and Reunion. But I think there are at least two ways in which the book deviates from it. And I think the first is that we tend to think of the Lost Cause as a sort of a unified voice among former Confederates, that they're all on the same page. And what I found, at least in the context of Virginians in the post-war period, especially around the politics of William Mahone, which I guess we can talk about in more detail, they're anything but, agreed on, who can claim ownership of the Confederate past. And so that's one way, I guess, in which it deviates slightly from Blight. The other way, I guess, is by the turn of the century, although I said earlier there are elements of reconciliation around stories of the Crater. It was not a battle that brought Northerners or Union veterans together to any great extent. I mean, there were reunions, or I should say, Union veterans did come down on occasion to visit the Crater battlefield. They even met Mahone on a couple of occasions. But when it came to reenactments, this was very much a Confederate event. Not even Confederate. It was more a Virginia-centered event. They don't even allow other Confederates, veterans, to in on the action. The focus is really on, the counterattack that Mahone's Virginians took part in, that they led that morning. And so it's very much sort of insulated within the Petersburg area, I guess you could say. It's a celebration for Virginians, rather than one that brings everyone together and shaking hands and trying to move on. So those, I guess, are two ways in which it deviates slightly.
It really is a fascinating case study to look at in terms of with the Crater. As you said, it is Virginia-centric, and there are these tensions. I wondered, one of the things when I was reading this that struck me over and over again was, as from a historical standpoint, in terms of tackling sources and source material, and wondering, there are people that are obviously mentioning, in the South, and for Northern sources as well, mentioning these USCT troops that are fighting, and then yet they are completely removed, obviously, from that narrative as you move towards the turn of the century. And I wonder how, as you're approaching this, methodologically, you were looking into the archives and then trying to craft your own narrative. Did you struggle with this at all? Were you, trying to wonder how to insert their voice more, how to insert it maybe where it wasn't? What was your thoughts with this?
When you say insert their voice, which voice do you mean?
The USCT troops.
Yeah, that was always, that was a difficult aspect of it, trying to find sufficient sources from the men who were, serving in the 4th Division. And I could only get so far with it. That was definitely a struggle. And, in the end, you end up having to try to piece together something through the eyes of either the officers that, commanded the 4th Division, but in most cases having to deal with, Confederates either, in the wake of the battle, their accounts, and then, of course, the post-war accounts. And so it was extremely frustrating. And I don't know if it's, I think for people who are looking for that USCT voice, they're probably going to walk away unhappy, I think, from the book. And, but I don't think I'm the only one who struggled with that. But I think that's sort of a casualty of sort of our Civil War and the legacies of race and everything else that goes with it.
Now, you mentioned with Petersburg these reunions. There are obviously two pretty substantial reenactments, 1903, 1937. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. Reading about these, it blew me away as you're describing these events. So I was wondering, perhaps for those who haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, I don't want you to give everything away, but if you could give a little bit of a sense of what these reenactments were actually like.
Oh, they are large-scale events. They are planned, in some cases, months in advance. The 1937 reenactment is actually planned at least a year in advance, and this marked the transition. The Crater Battlefield was in private hands for decades after the war, and finally the National Park Service gained control of it. But going back to 1903, you still have veterans who are at the crater, Virginians who are taking part in the event. It's very much an event that I think is meant to bring the different generations together, to sort of share those stories with the younger generation, to keep that lost cause alive. And of course, Douglas Southwell Freeman was in attendance as a young boy with his father, and as he puts it, this is the event that set him down the road to writing his magisterial histories of Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. But you get the sense that Petersburg probably shut down in 1903 on that particular day. They hold the reunion, the reenactment on the battlefield. They set off explosives to reenact the initial explosion. What's interesting, what I found particularly interesting, is that the accounts that surface at this time, on the one hand, the public side of the event, in terms of memory of the battle, is sort of devoid of any mention of the USCTs. And that's not surprising by then. But when you read their private accounts, and William Stewart, who was the commander of the 61st Virginia, I believe, he apparently took steps to collect accounts from the men under his command, and they're all housed in the archives at the Museum of the Confederates. It's an incredible collection. And he apparently sent them a list of questions, and when you read their responses, you get the sense that they are right back on July 30th, 1864, and they don't hold anything back when it comes to, remembering what it was like and what it meant to fight these black soldiers for the first time, at least on such a large scale. So that was an interesting aspect of this, of at least this reenactment, this divide between public and private. And then the 1937 reenactment is there were thousands of people in attendance, and Freeman actually does the narrative, for the event. He's doing the play-by-play, if you will. But it's covered in all of the major newspapers in Virginia and even beyond. So it must have been a wild event. And there were a couple veterans left, but it was Marines, I believe, who play the Union soldiers, and there are cadets from VMI who are playing the Confederates. And there's supposedly a film that was done, and I have some photographs in the book. that show this, but I would love to see the film, obviously, but I don't know where it is.
But it really is, from what I've read, unlike any other type of effort. I mean, it's not even an effort at reconciliation. These are glorified reenactments.
That's right.
Unlike any other battlefield.
No, that's right. It really is a celebration of Virginia. It is, and I think we tend to forget this is the last major victory for the Army of Northern Virginia. And, given the fact that the Virginia Brigade under Mahone's command, that those regiments were raised in that area, it was easy for them to attend, unit reunions during the post-war period. Mahone made this possible with his rail lines while he was in control. And, so they have a very close connection with that battlefield. And, they hold on to it.
I was wondering, since you just brought him up again, if you could talk a little bit about Mahone. I mean, the name is one that people certainly who are familiar with the Army of Northern Virginia would know. I think for a lot of us, though, when we think post-war Confederates who are having issues with, lost cause challenges, we think James Longstreet, probably first and foremost. But Mahone has quite a story of his own.
Yeah, Longstreet ain't got nothing. Mahone, let's put it that way. And really, Mahone was was sort of how I got started on this project. I started writing about him in graduate school at the University of Richmond, and it turned into the broader Crater Project. But he's a fascinating character, and most of his papers are housed at Duke University, and it is a humongous, it's a massive collection of personal papers, and he desperately needs a new biography. So if there's anyone out there who needs a project, a dissertation, go for it. Although, it's the biggest problem with Mahone is you can't read a word of his writing. It's just scribble. It's like reading an EKG scan. But he is a fascinating character, and his war record is mixed. He really doesn't come into his own until the Overland Campaign, and the Crater obviously is his shining moment. And he, after the war, he settles in Petersburg. He had lived there before the war, worked on a rail line, but after the war, he had this idea of consolidating different rail lines, which he eventually did with the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio. And he clearly understood that he could use his war record to advance his interests, making connections in Richmond, beyond that, gaining investments from the North. And so he used his war record to, I think, to attract all of those things and to improve his standing in the community. Now, that all came to an end in the 1870s. His railroad went into receivership. And he slowly gets into Virginia politics. And in 1879, he is the head of a third-party ticket called the Readjusters. And their main issue is about lowering Virginia's debt. It's a huge debt, not paying it all off, which some more conservative elements in Virginia want to do, but just pay it downward in part because Mahone wants to leave some money left over, some funds, public funds, for schools, for hospitals, and other, public projects. And many of these projects benefit the black community. In fact, the Readjusters are a biracial coalition. And they're in control of Virginia state politics for 4 years. And in a sense, you could say that Reconstruction comes late to Virginia. We tend to see Reconstruction as ending in 1877 in the South. But in Virginia, it starts in 1879, you could argue, and ends in 1883. And it's not happening at the hands of some Yankee regime. The guy in charge is a famous Confederate veteran. He's a war hero. And so they're in control for 4 years. And it's not surprising that Mahone's war record becomes a target. And it ends up, it's a great example, I think, a 19th century example of, I think, political swift voting. We think of that in context with John Kerry, who tried to market himself as a war hero a couple of years ago, and we saw how that backfired. It does with Mahone, because what it allows for his detractors, some of who are veterans from his old Virginia Brigade, they go after him, and they go after him through his war record. So you read in the newspapers that Mahone was never at the Crater battlefield. Or if he was, he never issued the order that leading to the charge of the Virginia Brigade, and all kinds of nasty broadsides. Mahone let soldiers starve. I mean, all kinds of just ridiculous things. But he never really recovers from it after 1883. And even when you read his obituaries, you find Virginians wanting to celebrate this man, but not quite being able to get over, his foray into politics. And it really does cost him long term, because Virginians do a wonderful job of forgetting him throughout much of the 20th century. So he's beginning to come back. I just found out there's a memorial for him in Petersburg this coming weekend. So something's happening in Petersburg, but he really is a fascinating character.
And as you said, I certainly hope somebody picks this up and maybe gives us a fresh reassessment of him. And you've started us down that road, certainly, with your work on him here. Yeah. I wonder, just for a last question here on the book, looking kind of more contemporary at interpretation on the battlefield at Petersburg today. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could give us a brief sense of what that's like. Obviously, it's different from, say, 50 years ago even, but just to give us a little bit of a fresh perspective on it.
Yeah, like I said earlier, the National Park Service inherited that sort of Virginia-centered account when it took over the battlefield in the mid-1930s. And I would say that that account, which sort of celebrated Virginians, ignored anything related to the racial aspects of the battle, was really in place until the late 1970s, maybe even early 1980s, when Chris Calkins came on board. And I think, when we look at the civil rights movement, some of the changes that take place in terms of local city government, the pressures that you can apply when you have when the racial profile of local government is different. The influence of scholarship, of course, going back to the 1950s. And then within popular culture, you begin to see this shift. In the late 70s, a team from Howard University came down to look at interpretation at Petersburg, and they offered a number of recommendations, which I sort of review in the book, and that sort of gets the ball rolling. And I think one of the big changes, and you can see this if you go down there today. First of all, the signage is very different. The racial profile of the staff is different. The kinds of stories they're telling, obviously, are much broader. And I think more important than anything else, the kind of outreach they're doing, especially in the last few years, with the local community. And I think that was one of the most interesting parts of this story. I spent a lot of time interviewing local residents of Petersburg, especially in the black community. You've got a majority black community, and many people, really never heard about the crater, what happened there. In fact, one gentleman mentioned that when he was a kid, if you wanted to go there, you sort of risked it because it was considered to be part of the white community in Petersburg. You just didn't go there. So a lot of that is changing, and so going there now, it really is, I imagine, for people who have that broad view in mind, a breath of fresh air. And I think you see those changes, obviously, more broadly throughout the National Park Service and other public sites.
Right. Well, we could talk about the book forever, but since I have you, I'd also like to touch, many of our viewers, I'm sure, are very familiar with your work, with your blog, Civil War Memory. And Keith Harris, who was on a few weeks ago, cited it as one of the best ones out there. So I was wondering, since we've got you, if you could give us a sense of, it's been around now for 7 years, right? 05?
7 years in November.
Yeah, coming up on 7 years. Is it what you've hoped it's been? Has it really changed a lot? Kind of give us maybe a little bit of an evaluation of it. And where you'd like to see it go.
November 2005. And I just finished my master's degree at University of Richmond. And, I've been reading all of these, scholarly studies of memory, Civil War, and I was just itching for a way to continue to share this stuff, as opposed to talking with, colleagues in the history department. And I just recently discovered, a couple of blogs. There weren't that many Civil War blogs out there, but one in particular that struck me as really interesting was Mark Grimsley's Blog Them Out of the Stone Age. He still has it up. He doesn't update it as much. But when I was reading it in 2005, it was wonderful because here you had a top-notch scholar who was talking about military history in a scholarly way, and he was trying to engage a broader community. How do you introduce these abstract, academic ideas to a broad audience? And I imagined... I was thinking, can you do this in the context of the Civil War and sort of some of the more academic questions related to memory. And so it was more an experiment. I really didn't go in with any preconceptions. And, I would say it took about a year to really begin to gain some traction. And I think once there were a few people early on who signed on, who became regular readers, professional historians, people who were doing public history, and that just got the word out. And, before I knew it, I had this nice core group of regular readers who were incredibly supportive. But then what was interesting was what it led to. So because I was talking about my own research interests and research I had already done, I started getting offers to share some of this stuff or to submit it in print. And so one of the chapters, for example, that I've been blogging about on the crater ended up in a collection of essays called The View from the Ground, which was edited by Aaron Sheehan Dean. And so, I would get offers to submit stuff for publication, offers to, join a panel at an academic conference. And then things just sort of took off from there. It just sort of built, the foundation was there, and then I could just sort of go from there. But I think it comes down to the fact that people found it interesting, and that kept me sort of, pushing it further. And eventually I got an offer to submit the manuscript. And, I never dreamt of being able to publish a book, but I think a lot of the stuff that I'm doing right now comes right out of the blog. Just being able to get your name out there. I'd never thought of social media like that. And so I just continue to be surprised. It's been an incredible ride.
Well, and I hope it's a ride that continues for you. And I know a lot of us who are following you enjoy. I mean, it's one of my favorite blogs, so I enjoy taking a look at it. And some really great insight and keeping us abreast of current events as well in the Civil War world.
Yeah.
Finally, before I let you go, Kevin, I was hoping you might be able to offer to our viewers maybe a book that you've come across recently that you'd highly recommend about the Civil War.
So the one nice thing about blogging, or at least having a successful blog, is I don't have to worry about buying books anymore. I get all the books sent to me. So I'm never reading one book. I'm always reading more than one book. So I'll share a couple things here. The one that I'm really enjoying now, and I think it has more to do with that I'm now living in Boston, trying to understand this rich history around me. But Stephen Kantrowitz's new book, More Than Freedom, which it's an incredible history of the black community from roughly 1829 to 1889, and it's just really well written. Enjoying that. A recommendation that actually came from Pete Carmichael from early on. Whenever Pete gets excited about something, I tend to take him at his word, and so he recommended War Stories by Francis Clark, and I just finished it. And having read it, with that recent documentary, the PBS documentary on Civil War and Death, was really interesting, just getting a sense of what is covered in that documentary as opposed to sort of what Clark is pushing in her book. I highly recommend both of them. But I'll throw out, I recently read Jim Downes's new study on slavery, which is phenomenal, and even Megan Kate Nelson's Ruined Nation. There's just so much out there that is worth reading. I mean, you can just spend your entire day, if you have a day to spend like that, just reading. And so it's the sesquicentennial has been great for new books, that's for sure. And so plenty to read.
And I must say that I didn't force you to mention these names, but those were several people, including Megan and Jim and Pete, who have all had interviews with us here on Behind the Lines. So
you're interviewing the right people, I think.
It definitely is a great time in terms of scholarship and great books, all of them. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, remembering the Battle of the Crater, War is Murder, out now. Definitely worth a read if you want to take a look at how one battle was remembered and contested. So thanks, Kevin, and I hope to have you back on again soon.
Thanks, David.